This is Genesis in a bit more detail. For one thing, you'll notice these project areas are huge. Genesis is roughly 200 kilometers by about 100 kilometers wide. This is a large, large territory. If you were to start driving at the north end, about 2 hours later, if you keep to the speed limit, which is often hard to do in Saskatchewan, given the flatness of the land and the roads, 2 hours later, you will be at the bottom. There's several important things to note about this map and why we are excited to begin part of our exploration effort here. The red bodies, and there's about 40 of them, they've been identified as being possible prospects. And here's the reason why. They are aeromagnetic anomalies that may or may not be associated with intrusions, or they're basement structures, such as basement blocks, basement uplift. So, for one of those two reasons, the basement complex has been moved, it's been shuffled, it has been uplifted. Associated with that will be fracturing, faulting, naturally occurring conduits for the gas to migrate. So each closure, prospective closure, will have some sort of geophysical anomaly associated with it. There's a second thing. Back in the late 1940s and 1950s, when oil companies first began exploring Saskatchewan for oil, the companies conducted huge regional seismic programs, tens of thousands of miles of seismic done in the late 40s, early 1950s, because they were doing exploration at scale. An immense amount of data. And you could argue, a geophysicist would say, oh, that's so old. What good is it? Well, nowadays, yeah, it is very primitive. It was calculated by hand, dynamite shooting, limited amount of recording. But what it did do is nevertheless, it identified structures. And the structures that the old seismic identified were only the biggest of structures out there. So chances are, on a map from the 1950s, if you saw a seismically defined structure, chances are it's real and it had to be pretty big for the primitive seismic technology of the 1950s compared to today to identify. It's a good database, and guess what? A sixth reason why Saskatchewan's a good place to look? Because since the 1940s, the government has required anybody who does exploration to file and submit their data with the government, and after a certain confidentiality period, that data becomes available to the general public. So to do regional area exploration, and I've worked other jurisdictions, it's probably the only place where you can find this historic legacy data and use it to define hydrogen prospects, structures, helium prospects. All of that is available, and that data has been incorporated in our regional work. The third criterion is the mapping of shallower horizons. While the basement complex in Saskatchewan is very much a frontier. In fact, when people ask me, Steve, are there any frontier areas left to explore in Saskatchewan or Alberta? I have no hesitation in saying, yes, there is. It is the basement complex. It is what is down at the bottom of the rock pile. That is frontier. There have been several 100,000 wells drilled in Saskatchewan. But what is amazing is out of those several 100,000, maybe 1,000, less than 0.1%, have actually drilled down to the basement complex. And those that have, almost all of them were in search of oil and natural gas. However, there are a lot of shallow wells that may not have gone down 2,000 or 3,000 meters, but certainly have gone down 600 to 700 to 1,000 meters that provide elevation data for shallower marker beds. Well, we've mapped one of those shallower marker horizons, and that tends to act as a good proxy for deeper structures, especially younger, deeper structures, the sort we're looking for. Because when the bottom moves, it pushes everything up to the shallower levels. So the data density increases. Those are the three things we're using to define a prospect along the Genesis trend. The other item I'd like to add here is the fact that there is some method to why the Genesis trend only extends so far to the east and no further. That's a very good reason. One is geological. The second is the way permits are handed out within the province. Anything to the east of this edge is considered by the province to be the potash commercial zone. Now, Saskatchewan happens to be the Saudi Arabia of potash. It is one of the largest global producers of potash. And those mines are situated out here. The potash is hosted within Middle Devonian evaporite rocks called the prairie evaporite, which consists of salt, NaCl, and potash, KCl, which is mined. The edge of the commercial potash belt corresponds to the eastern edge of Genesis. To the west of there, the salts have been removed. They are not there. They've been dissolved out. Now, geologically, why is this important? All of the rock basement complex gases that are generated here migrate to the northeast. They migrate up dip to the northeast. And they will migrate, if you remember the elements of a petroleum system, until they hit some sort of barrier. Well, that barrier is the prairie evaporite salt. It's the potash beds. That stops them cold. They can no longer continue migrating up dip until they're released. So we are right up against that regional barrier. If there are gases that are released all of southwest Saskatchewan, and if those gases move to the northeast, that is how far they will go. So if I were to pick one area in the province where these large closures may contain clean gases, it will be along Genesis.